Good morning, everyone, and in my thick Australian accent, I'll say g'day. How are you? Look, it's a pleasure to be able to come and spend some time here in France with you all here at FIRA, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have spent some time here through the organisers. Just to share with you, I thought I'd give you a little bit of history about me and where I come from in Australia. In fact, on the left there is actually my grandfather, who was a farmer in Australia. He was a horseman in the days when pre-tractors, when horses exist, and he actually came here 100 years ago actually for the freedom of Europe and volunteered to come here, and that was quite significant. But over his lifetime he's seen profound change in the way that we farm in Australia, going from teams of horses with the plough to the introduction of the tractor. In fact, I still have that tractor today. It's a family heirloom. And we saw a lot of mechanisation. In fact, Australia has a long history of mechanisation. In fact, was the original country to develop the combine harvester. H.V. Mackay in Sunshine near Melbourne in Victoria developed the first harvester, and it was actually one of Australia's biggest exports around the turn of the 18th, 19th century, in the 1800s to early 1900s. And it was quite a revolutionary technology. It actually enabled the broad Australian areas of Australia to become much more productive. I in fact grew up on the farm myself. There's a combine harvester that you could see there on our farm, where I drove that between the ages of 13 to 21 until I became a scientist, and gave me great grounding understanding what the actual needs are of the farming community. And I think that's the thing that we look at with these new technologies, is how's it going to make a difference to farmers' business? How's it going to give them confidence and de-risk their operations? More recently, as a scientist, I spent a lot of time in no-till systems development, so planting without cultivation, development and involvement in the adoption of controlled traffic farming, where we restrict the wheel tracks to a single point in the field, and it means that both the planter, the sprayer, the harvester, the wheel tracks always go in the same place, and that minimises soil compaction. That's been revolutionary for us, combined with no-till. The real technology that helped drive that for us was the introduction of auto steer. Real-time kinematic 2 centimetre accurate auto steer made the practice of that so much easier. And today is standard practice, like I shared with you yesterday. 85% of both no-till and auto steer adoption in Australia. It's been quite revolutionary. And I actually came more recently to the National Capital in Canberra to help industry, I suppose, navigate access to new technologies, particularly introduction of new complex technologies in crop protection, and also as a national investment manager in that space. So Australia is quite a pioneer in the introduction of new technologies, not so much in just being involved in their development, but particularly in how producers use them. And I think that's the difference between Australian producers. We actually have no subsidies in our country to support the farmer. So the farmer has to be, as we describe it, lean and mean with their production systems, and actually has to be very productive and efficient. And so when we find technologies that work, there's very high rates of adoption. Labour cost and labour availability in Australia, as I mentioned yesterday, is a significant factor. It's not just the cost, but actually trying to find people to work in the remote areas of Australia has been quite difficult. And the mining industry, the mineral mining industry in Australia, has become highly autonomous and is actually one of the world leaders in the development of those systems. And in Australia, we're actually getting a lot of impact from the mine industry, the mindset of both government and the agriculture sector in terms of how we're going to use these technologies to improve our efficiency as well. As I mentioned yesterday, an important thing to recognise is we actually have few regulatory barriers for agricultural machine autonomy, except perhaps when it comes to application of pesticides. And our company, AgTech Centric, is currently supporting industry in the development of code of practice for farm autonomy, and that's going to be quite a significant step. So we're working with the tractor manufacturers that export to Australia, so John Deere, AGCO, Case New Holland Industrial, and also Kubota from Japan. That's going to be quite a considerable change for us. Australia is market ready for robotic technology and autonomy, and it's actually an ideal place to commercialise. Our low regulatory requirements, and particularly working with industry and development of codes of practice means that it becomes an easy place, I suppose, for companies to incubate new technology, get some real practical experience on the ground with producers. One of the opportunities you have in Australia is to completely remove the operator from the field and operate machines remotely, which is a regulatory issue here in Europe, and particularly perhaps in California in the US. So it does create some opportunity. Just to share with you, my business partners, we all have a lot of experience in national strategy and investment, both in the industry sector through industry levies from producers, but also in the commercial sector. And we've been involved in development of national strategies, everything from plant genetics and royalty programs to commercialisation of new biotechnologies. And for myself in particular, I've been quite involved with some of the lead agribusiness companies in Australia in development of their national cereal strategies and digital agriculture strategies. I suppose the common element that we all have as a company is we have very deep connections with industry. We've actually helped many industries develop their national investment strategy for research, and that has been an absolute joy to be able to work with those producers across Australia, both in broadacre grains, horticulture, the vegetable industry, particularly in sugar with one of my colleagues, and we've also had some association with some of the animal industries as well. But our company is very much about navigating access to new technologies for producers, and if you're interested in trying to understand the Australian, Australasian market more, then please come and talk to me, because we actually have a lot of depth of experience understanding about the needs. Our model is very simple. Because of our relationships we've developed both with the industry sector, also with government and with the investment framework in Australia, we've actually been able to use what we call the AgTech Sandbox. It's basically how we can actually bring all the parties together in a very pragmatic way to work through how we can actually ideally manage the commercialisation of product with minimal need for regulation. So we have a lot of dialogue with the introduction with these new technologies with the Australian government and also state governments around how these technologies can deliver benefits for industry on safety and these sorts of things. So Australia has a light touch to regulation as long as they're confident that industry is taking a strong lead through codes of practice in terms of how to use these things. So industry often needs some assistance with that, and I suppose that's what we specialise in doing, is helping producers and the industry sector and the commercial sector work through those opportunities. And we've had some tremendous success there. So most recently on investment in minor use chemical access for developing crop industries in Australia and plant industries, particularly in the digital agriculture space and also in the biotechnology space. And we have actually done quite a bit of commercial work, particularly around the use of robotics in Australia. And an important area to recognise is actually how do we actually provide in-field communication of these systems. In Australia, because of our remoteness, we actually have a lot of, I suppose, expertise developed around long-range communications, and we can certainly, if you're interested in that, provide some assistance to you. That's all I have to present to you, but thank you for the opportunity to speak to you here in Toulouse.
Thank you, Dr. Rainbow. Loads of time for questions. Yes, there's one gentleman raising his head up there. Thank you.
Richard Martin and Bill with Ag Funder News again. Thanks very much for your talk. I was just sort of wondering if you could say a little bit more about Australia's connectivity in field, because I know that in the rural areas connectivity is poor, but if you could sort of elaborate how they've actually sort of pioneered that in-field connectivity? That would be
It's
great.
a very good question. It's actually come up as almost the number one issue for the commercial rollout of autonomy in Australia. Essentially, 60% of producers in Australia have access to GSM, 3G, 4G telephone technology. So 40% producers don't have access to that just because of their remoteness. In those particular cases, they're reliant on HF radio and systems that support that. However, the Australian government's invested significantly in providing digital connectivity in rural Australia through SkyMaster satellite programs, and increasingly producers are then linking systems off SkyMaster, which is a satellite-based internet connection, providing their own what we call local area network farm infrastructure for basically Wi-Fi on farm. But more recently, off the back of SkyMaster, the government has recently approved the use of mobile satellite connectivity. So essentially you can put a satellite dish on your utility or truck or whatever you want to call your vehicle here on the farm and actually drive that vehicle out to where you're working and then provide local Wi-Fi connectivity in your area field operation. And that's a technology I think is going to become pretty common in the next few years. So while I suppose there's some hiccups in terms of remoteness, Australia being the great innovators, we use that. There's been a lot of investment in low Earth orbit, low bitrate satellite systems. We've got 2 companies now in Adelaide that are launching constellations, particularly across Australia, but some of those constellations are being involved in other areas across the world. One of the things that we recognise with autonomy, ideally we want a more secure system than just GSM or 3G, 4G. You need some fail-safe. So if you've got that, you still might need a HF radio fail-safe communication system. Likewise, if you have radio or local Wi-Fi, then also having access to a satellite fail-safe is probably appropriate as well. So there's a lot of discussion that's going to go on about where we think is the minimum sort of requirements for remote operations, but it's a particular problem for us because of our lack of mobile phone or cell phone connectivity.
Another question?
Thank you for your talk. Jean-Marc Dardier from Agrico in Italy. As an outsider, what would you say are the top hurdles to overcome in Europe to see a widespread adoption of autonomous vehicles, robots, as we've seen here?
It's an interesting question because I've been asking the same question myself for the last 2 days, and I think the challenge for you in Europe is actually how can you ultimately get government and the community to agree to remote monitoring of autonomous robots and tractors, to essentially remove the operator from the field, because until you do that, it's going to be difficult to really deliver some of the efficiency dividends that you're looking for. Immediate opportunity, leader-follower type technology and having a swarm of robots probably provides significant efficiencies, but longer term, you need to keep people busy. That's what we find in Australia, and to just sort of basically sit there and just monitor is kind of okay, but it's very difficult to stay awake. And you know, we've got such high rates of semi-autonomy in Australia now that boredom has become a key issue, and I think we need to create an environment for producers and people working on farms and on the land that actually stimulates them, that keeps them interested and keeps them engaged. If it's just continually pressing a button every 10 minutes just to keep the machine running, well, that is perhaps not the best. So, yeah, long term. So I think that's a challenge, is how you're going to move to complete remote autonomy.
All right, thank you. We have time for a short last question, if there is one. Otherwise, you'll be here all day, right?
Yeah,
All right.
I'll be here all day. And like I say, that you know, if you want to get some practical experience with your equipment, with remote autonomy, Australia is the place to come. You know, there might be a number of companies keen to get some experience in those scenarios and actually prove the technology in those environments, because that may, I think, help support the argument back here in Europe to perhaps look at less restrictive regulations perhaps in the future. But there's some opportunities to road test, for want of a better word, in Australia.